Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Consul General of Ireland. It still feels really strange to do this on a screen and not to welcome you in person and say that it's nice to see you all. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm really delighted to welcome both Peter Geoghegan and Michael Harding too. Many of you may know either or both of them through their work, but I hope that by the end of today's event, you'll feel that you know them both a little better. Michael is joining us today from Arigna in County Leitrim, where he spent most of this year and where he's written his latest book, the sixth in his series of memoirs, What is Beautiful in the Sky. Along with his books, his column in the Irish Times, and his podcast on Patreon, Michael wonderfully chronicles ordinary life with a gentle intimacy. Peter Geoghegan is well known as an award-winning journalist and has become a very familiar name this year as his latest book, Democracy for Sale, has become a bestseller.
Jane, thank you so much for that, and thank you for the very warm introduction. And thanks again to the Irish Consulate for putting this event on. I think it's great to be able to have a conversation ahead of the holidays. It's a shame it's not in person, but we've been saying that a lot this year. So hopefully even down the Zoom line, it means hopefully the people who might not have been able to get there in person are able to catch it. So that maybe there is a bit of a silver lining in all that. I'm talking to you now from my flat in Glasgow, in the West End of Glasgow, but I kind of wanted to, I wanted to talk to Michael, and I'm really kind of very pleased to have a chance to chat to Michael over the next kind of hour or so, and please do get your questions in. And I'm going to be, because I get to ask the questions at the start, I feel a bit both nervous, but also kind of, I feel a bit like I've got a special invitation to kind of ask kind of things I want to ask. So I might do a little bit at the start, so please forgive me. Michael, you're in Arigna. I'm a Longford man. I spent 5 months actually this summer during the lockdown in Longford. Lived with my mum. I went back to try and get my mum ready for lockdown. I came back from London. I thought I'd be there for a couple of days, and I ended up there for 5 months. I must say I have a lot of wistfulness at the moment. I find myself missing the landscape of Ireland, of rural Ireland, and of places like Leitrim and Longford. And I guess I just wanted to, could you tell me what it's like there today, if you don't mind?
Well, hello, and it's lovely to be with you all. What is it like here? First of all, as I look out the window to my left, I'm looking at Loch Allen. That's about 11 kilometres of that large lake that's at the top of the Shannon. And as I look beyond the lake, I can see Slieve Éireann, the entirety of Slieve Éireann. And at the moment, it's covered in a kind of a mist, the usual Irish mist. And so the outlines are very soft and gentle, and closer to my window are the beech trees in the garden, who stand out bare-boned at this time of year. And it's very beautiful. My stove is on here behind me, warming me here in this cold shed at the back of the house. And other than that, it's hard to believe that I'm speaking to somebody in Glasgow. The technology is amazing. The idea that I'm actually conversing with people through the Irish Consulate and through all the various people who might be watching this, that's amazing, because I'm on my own here. This is a very solitary life I live. And it's a really amazing thing about technology that you can do this. Yeah.
Have you found that? Yeah, like, how did you find that? Like, say over the last the course of this year, like, has that helped you? Has that been a help? Do you think? I found when I spent five months in Longford, which I wouldn't have expected I would do at this stage of my life, in my late 30s, that I'd be able. I continued working but to all intents and purposes, I was back living with my mum, like I hadn't been since I was a teenager, But the one thing I found really interesting about that was I did still feel there was an ability to be connected with people outside of that, which I think kind of was really different and allowed you to kind of to feel close, but also there was a kind of ability to talk to people in ways that we probably hadn't been able to before. I think it would have been a totally different experience even 15 years ago to have had the last year that we've had.
Well, when we came here first, which is about 25 years ago, there was a huge distinction between urban and rural society. In those days, I used to write plays for the RB in Dublin, and when I finished a play, I would go to a pronto print shop, and I would get the copy that I had made on a manual typewriter photocopied about 7 times, and that would cost me about 70 punts, Irish pounds at the time. And that was a slow technology, and you then posted those to various theatres to see would anybody accept your play. Now I live in a world where I can finish a play or a book here, and press a button and send the entire manuscript to a theatre or to my editor in Hachette, and they can correct it and send it back and say, we don't like this, we don't like that. It's like living with all that stuff in the next room. And it means that living in rural Ireland becomes, or rural Scotland, I'm sure, or rural England, it means it's more possible than it was 25 years ago. You felt excluded when you left the city in those days. And when young people grew up in Ireland 25 years ago, they tended to veer towards the city because the city was the only place that it was possible. Like if you wanted to get on or have a career in the arts, or sort of particularly in creativity in the arts, well, you just had to go to a city. You had to go to Dublin, or I suppose in Donegal that I go to a lot, there's a huge interaction with Glasgow. Donegal very often seems a real kind of part of Scotland. But for me here, it was a big break to come away from Dublin and to live in the rural area. Nowadays, it's completely different. And there's one issue about that which is important, and that is, philosophically, we have tended to live a very urban creed and culture for about 50 years in Western Europe. Society has been very committed to the concept of urban society, of the kind of existential anxiety and confusion that is created in urban centres. And we tend to have abandoned the sort of lyrical, more confident relationship with nature and with the kind of environs around us that rural life encourages. But now we're at a point where, because of climate change and because of COVID and because of many other issues, people are and because we now have the technology to live in rural Ireland or rural anywhere, people are now beginning to realize that maybe there was philosophical value and insights available through the kind of confidence that people had in rural areas with nature around them that we could all learn from. And I'll give you just one example. I say this very often. You won't save the trees by thinking about them, right? And there's a tremendous amount of the green movement and like climate change movements who are very focused on what other people are doing wrong. And then they have a very clear agenda based on numbers and facts and figures to show how if we don't change, the planet is burning up and we're all going to be ruined. But that won't change anybody's heart. What will change people's heart is love. It's the only thing that works in the human species. And so you need to love the trees if you're going to save them. And the only way to love the trees is to spend time with the trees. And that's where, again, rural society and culture and the preservation of rural culture becomes hugely politically important going forward, as they say.
Well, it's interesting because, I was really struck with that over the time I spent in Longford. I came from London. I do a job which is actually quite current affairs. I'm an investigative journalist. I'm often quite busy. I was very busy, but I was doing it from Longford, and it was really interesting. Well, I almost thought that the issues was much to do with status in cities. There's a kind of status thing where you live in this. If you don't live in the city, you're nobody. If you're not in London, if you're not in a big centre, if you're not in Dublin, you're not important. And I wonder if that's maybe the last year might decenter that a bit. We'll start to realise that that's not really the case, or it doesn't have to be the case.
My experience in Ireland is that has been changing over maybe 20 years. 25 years ago, if I again were, going to Dublin for rehearsals or going to meet a director or somebody in the theatre might ask me afterwards, do you have to get your train? And I'd say yes. And they'd say, and where are you going? And I'd say, Leitrim. And they'd say, is that very far? And there was a real urban mentality that, my God, Leitrim, what time did you have to get up at this morning to be here? It seemed...
Yeah, completely. It's as if it is. I even get it just going to London from Glasgow, even though it's still an urban place. People talk to you as if you said, I've come from the moon.
Yeah. Well, I do think that's changed hugely. In my experience, if I go to, as I do sometimes, to do radio stuff or television stuff in Dublin, I find that there's more a spread of of rural voices and rural backgrounds in the people who are researchers and who are working in the media. And so the idea that you're living in Leitrim and they might want you to do the Ray D'Arcy show, let's say, this afternoon, it's no big deal anymore. It can all be done technologically. So again, I think it's actually, if I may say, I do think it's actually becoming fashionable to be living in rural Ireland, whereas 25 years ago it wasn't so hot, you know.
So very much, yeah, especially some parts of it. Like, Michael, just to bring you back to the topic of nature as well, because I actually chimed a lot with the kind of experience I had. You know, as I say, like I spent 5 months back in Longford, and the last time I'd spent any period of time in Longford actually had been, we might talk about that later, about mental health. It'd been after a mental health episode in my late teens. But I hadn't spent that much time in Longford. I'd always thought it was a kind of, I'd go and visit my folks and that would be it. And I never thought it was a very beautiful place. And I found in those 5 months, I did a lot of things to find the beauty in it. Myself and my friend John Connell, the writer, we canoed down the Camlin, the local river in Longford. We hiked a lot. I went fishing. And I found huge amounts of beauty, even in a place where a lot of people in Ireland don't think there's a lot of beauty. And there's a lot of people will talk about the beauty of Leitrim as well. But do you think there's a kind of sense as well within which, like, you know, without getting too pat about it, you know, I know it's easy to kind of, like, this year has been very hard for a lot of people financially too, so they're not able to sit around and like navel gaze, and maybe it's easy for me or somebody to do that. But there is a sense in which we're seeing that, like, there's an actual physical, almost a very being of being outside, being in an environment, being in the natural world, you know, the kind of healing properties of it.
Yeah, I think that it's how you package it as well, because, you know, it's only recently that Ireland began to package the whole western coast from Donegal down to Kerry and call it the Wild Atlantic Way. And suddenly you have this new concept, new single package, which gave you 2,500 miles of Atlantic coastline. And it became an astonishing thing. Whereas when it was just going to Bundoran, I might say to somebody in Dublin, I was going to Bundoran, and they'd laugh, and in a kind of a snoozy way say, "Oh, Cavan sur Mer," meaning that, like, all the Cavan would go to Bundoran for the summer. And
Derry sur Mer too, I guess.
Bundoran was seen as a kind of a place of low class desperados who just spent all the day with slot machines. And it had a very bad name, and the name wasn't deserved, because Bundoran culturally was a wonderful place always for music. But now, if you say Bundoran to anybody around the world, they say surfing. Oh yeah, so, because it's now one of the hottest places for surfing. And I think that definitely how you package rural Ireland, again, you talked about your friend John Connell. John is a Longford writer, and he wrote a wonderful book, The Cow Book. And nobody had really ever done exactly what he did before, and it's a tremendous book if anybody's looking for a good book on farming rural Ireland with a kind of a poetic insight. But it's how you package it. Now, what's deeper than that, I think, is the reason it's being packaged, and I'll go back to the same point. I think there's a very important philosophical shift needed culturally. People are exhausted and tired with, I think they're exhausted and tired with Marxism, to be honest. I think they're definitely madly exhausted with capitalism, which has proved itself to be a beast that just eats up everything. But I think that underneath it, there are philosophical tectonic plates moving. And I think that what's happening is that rather than see the linear journey from, let's say, pastoral, you know, Wordsworthian, Yeatsian kind of old-fashioned lyrical rural culture, and then moving into this sense of Joyce and modernism and the age of anxiety and Samuel Beckett and a kind of an awakening to existential urban anomie, as Durkheim would say. Instead of that, we're now beginning to shift back and say we may be losing something, and it may be actually connected with how we heal the planet from this disastrous kind of global warming and burning up the earth. There may be a space where we need to rediscover the relationality in rural life, the relationship that people have with the earth beneath their feet, with the lake outside, with the trees outside. it could be very important for the philosophical insights that we develop and move forward and begin to heal the planet.
There's a couple of things I'd like to pick up on there, Mike, because I think that's very interesting. And the first one that strikes me is I've lived in the UK for over 15 years, and we have a very different relationship. People in the UK with the rural space is very different. But, people don't know, grandfather was a farmer, come from farming. I know lots of people who are farmers. Almost everybody in Ireland knows someone who's a farmer. In Britain, it's not the case. There isn't the same connection, I think, with the land, and it's for a bunch of reasons. Industrialisation has been the biggest one. Obviously Britain industrialised, and Ireland almost skipped industrialisation. At least the Free State and the Republic did. Almost we went straight from the agrarian to the kind of hyper capitalism you're talking about. But I wonder, does that mean that Ireland has almost an opportunity in some ways to because of that connection that people still have? I'm really struck. Most of the people I went to school with, a lot of them live in Dublin, but they still have a connection back to a rural area or a kind of a less urban area, a non-city area. Do you think that makes it it gives Ireland something that we should almost be thinking about right now rather than in 10 or 15 years' time?
I think it is, and I think it's the key. It's the key to how you understand what Ireland is within the European system. Mm. You're right to say the Industrial Revolution is something that did not happen in Ireland. And it's not like that it didn't really happen or didn't sort of happen. It fundamentally didn't happen. Mm. And
outside of the north, Belfast, outside of Northern Ireland,
an enormous disadvantage for maybe a century. But ironically, there are now advantages to it. And you have to tie them in with another thing that was different. And that is that because there was so much agrarian abuse by landlordism in the 19th century, there was an agrarian revolution in Ireland around the 1870s, 1880s, led by a fellow called Michael Davitt from Mayo, who worked in the Lancaster mills in the UK and who lost an arm and all the rest of it. And he was passionately for the need that people should own their own land. And so the reformations of the Land League that were followed by the reformations in the 1920s in the new Free State as it was then, they created a kind of fabric of protection around communities in rural Ireland that other countries in Europe, not just England, but right across Europe, as far as Łódź in Poland, in the 19th century, from Łódź to Manchester, cotton mills were humming and the industrialization was humming, and people were divested of their rural roots, and they didn't value the rural roots, or they were evicted from the rural roots. But one way or the other, we were, by accidents of history, fortunate enough to be in such a poor state that we held on to this fabric of community, particularly, I would say, through Michael Davitt. And I think that is not studied enough in Irish history. It's absolutely crucial, because if you have somebody, a writer like Moncon McGann, who again at the moment has a wonderful book out, the 40 Names for a Townland or something, I don't know, I forget the name of it, but, or you look at John Creedon's book, which is about townlands, you'll realise they're the bestsellers. That anything to do with the name of a townland and kind of the concept of community at the local micro level, everybody in Ireland reads. They're fascinated by it because we have this very, very strong sense of belonging. And it does come historically from the fact that we had the cultural, socio-political contexts that kept us. And it kept us, like, all that was negative in the 20th century. When urbanization, development and capitalism were seen as the driving forces of philosophy and culture, this is where life was going. This is really good. You would be absolutely ashamed to say you came from some little rural village in Longford. But that has changed.
I was struck as well. I was watching during the week, there was a documentary on the BBC, a comedian called Ramesh Ranganathan, I think it's how you don't really pronounce his name, was in the Hebrides, and he was every year this guy goes, this comedian goes to these different parts of the world to do a kind of Christmas special of like being in somewhere very remote. He'd been to the Sahara, he'd been to Antarctica, and because of COVID this year, he went to the Western Isles of Scotland, which I must confess, is one of my favourite places in the whole world. And he went to the beach at Luskintyre and Harris, and it was very beautiful. But I was really struck, he was there, he's been shown around by a crofter, which is, kind of a Scottish version of a small farmer, called Donald Sween. And And Donald spoke very elegantly about the kind of erasure of Gaelic culture and of the clearances, the history of the clearances of Scotland, in which around the same time as the famine in Ireland, the potato blight did hit Scotland too, but also there was kind of clearing the land of people so you could replace them with sheep. And the two things that strike you when you spend time in rural Scotland is that they have, in some ways, the remains of the houses are there. It wasn't that depopulated as it is now. You go through vast areas of rural Scotland and see nobody. You will not see a single human being. You could drive for an hour and not see a human being. But it wasn't like that. You can see the remains of houses. You can see the remains of communities. And it does feel like in Ireland, there is still the ability, or almost, even if it's a generation ago, there's still something there that people want to connect with. There's a need almost within us, whereas I think in Scotland you're having to educate a new generation that are totally remote from that about a past, which is always much more difficult, I think.
I think that the curse of emigration and I suppose dispossession of our play in, because the heartbreak about emigration is that if it goes too long, you do break the connection. I know a story of a man who emigrated from Fermanagh to New York, and all his life he was unhappy, and he had a fiddle but he never played it, and he married and he had children, but they all said he was always lonesome for home. And once in his life, when he was in his 70s, he agreed to make a trip home to Fermanagh. And he came back and he went to the old house where he had grown up. And it was just gone. It was just bare stone walls with nettles where the kitchen table might have been, and an open sky where the roof might have been. And there was one big nail stuck in the wall. And he pulled it out. And he went back to New York. And when he was home in New York, he hammered the nail into the wall in the sitting room. And then he hung his fiddle on the wall. And of course it was a nail that he had remembered a fiddle sitting on when he was a child, and the way that music would have been part of the fabric of growing up. But it's a story to me that shows the broken-heartedness and the fact that sometimes when the heart breaks, it doesn't heal. There's no way back. And I think that emigration is one of those things, or certainly was in the 19th and 20th century. So that for people, even in Ireland, I lived in West Cavan, and it is a heartbreak to me to go back sometimes to West Cavan and to drive around a place where I once went from house to house with fun and joy and music, and now it's all forestry. It's empty. So emigration does break the heart, and sometimes if you leave it for one or two generations, there ain't no going back. And that's really, really, I think, one of the great tragedies of Scotland is that vanishing of the population. I think it's one of the great consolations I have in Ireland, no matter how bad things are sometimes, but that we're actually still here. And that they passed laws, I think, in the 20s or 30s, limiting the extent even of land that a landlord could own, which was a wonderful thing, because it meant that it was viable for small communities and small villages that were once simply tenants on somebody's land, and they were paying money to, Mr. Tennyson or Mr. Maxwell or Trinity College or whatever, and that's what the communities that are in Ireland from Kerry to Donegal, they all have a history of once being tenant farmers. So they cling even more tightly to their sense of community now. And now, hopefully, we've come to a point where the very style of life they have is beginning to be revealed as a very strong and helpful foundation for a new way of being in the world as modern human beings. I don't mean we're all going to go back to living in like hippies and farms and, no electricity, but I mean that simply the connectivity of love that you need with the environment, if you're to save the planet, will only be got by nurturing love experientially in rural places where you can actually experience nature.
It's interesting you say that. There's a couple of things I'd like to pick up, but the first one, I think that's a really interesting thing, this idea of being in the world. I've been really struck, after 5 months in Longford, the two things I wanted to do wasn't to, I do miss things like the pub. I missed the pub in Longford for sure. I missed my local. I missed all that. But the things I wanted to do was, one, I wanted to see the sea because I've been landlocked for so long, and the other, I wanted to climb a big mountain. And I went to the Highlands and spent 10 days in the Highlands and did those things. And those were the things that I was yearning for. I found it wasn't the kind of urban life that I think we all become. Once you're in it, it's so fast paced and all the rest of it. And I do wonder about that being in the world, because I look back, in any other year I would have travelled so much. I've been travelling almost every single week, and I barely travelled at all this year. I've barely been anywhere. And in some ways what I miss about that is actually just seeing of different places and seeing different people. I miss that, and that's for sure. But that level of movement I don't miss at all. I really don't. And you actually, once you realise how much of the movement you were doing wasn't that useful at all, and could be replicated sometimes in things like this. Yeah. And that there's other ways, and I wonder about that. Is there other ways of being in the world? Not necessarily, not everybody can do a job that you can do remotely down a Zoom phone. But I do wonder, just in more general, in terms of like, what are the tangible things that we should look for? Like, what are the things? I wonder about that. Is there opportunities? Because we know that the climate has changed, and we know that change is coming, and it almost feels like this year was the thing that you couldn't ignore, the fact that change is coming, and that the way of being in the world that we've had in Ireland and lots of other countries for the last few decades is not really sustainable.
Well, I think that probably, the innovation that will change the way 6 billion of us survive will probably be something that comes out of urban areas where there are, vast universities and vast scientific centres of research. But what I'm saying, I suppose, is that none of it will really work unless it's underpinned by a powerful philosophical view that is beyond existential anxiety. Something that actually, in a post-religious culture, gives us back a sense of faith, a sense of personal relationship with the trees, the begonia plant on the patio, the little pot plant that you have in your room, or the vast forests of Scotland or Ireland, the mountains and the sea, that give us back a relationship of reverence, that we are addressing it not as an it, but as a thou, thou. That was Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher. His great book was I, Thou, that the relationship between me and the mountain or me and the ocean is like a relationship with an other person. And that really typifies the sacred. And you get it also in the work of people like George Steiner in the 1980s in a great book called Real Presences, where again he talks about the fact that even in art, we're wasting our time being intellectual and interrogating everything in some sort of sociological or psychological manner. We're wasting our time unless we're experiencing the sense of downess, the sense of the actual art itself is sacred. I love the work of Anthony Gormley, for example, because he creates pieces that are not outside nature, but they actually stand in nature. They don't stand on a plinth. They're there as real presences. And where do you get a way to underpin that philosophy, that sense of a new aesthetic which is about religious faith in a post-religious culture? We're not going back to institutional religions. I think that in even 100 years, we will be looking at all institutionalization of religion as obsolete, as completely obsolete. So we're not going back there. But we still have to carry on holding within us some philosophical disposition that allows us to be people of faith. If we don't do that, this earth is going to burn up.
It's interesting because it makes you think of people like Marcelo Iliade as well, as sacred and profane, the idea of spaces. And I think that's why Nietzsche was so popular as well, because he might have been mad, but he kind of did cotton on to this idea that we needed religion as something beyond an institution.
Yeah.
And I think that to me is what I always took. I haven't read Nietzsche in many years, but I took from it was that need, was a deeply human need.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that makes religion probably a little bit iffy as a subject is that the 20th century attempts to hold on to something, what they tended to do, and Nietzsche did this, was to hold on to myth. And myth, in a sense, brought them really down a dark road. Because without having abandoned the sort of Christian myths and having abandoned sense of Christian faith and community, you just have to, you don't say that Wagner was a bad person, he was a genius musician, but the culture of that time, right into Nietzsche's time and into the 30s, was so much about trying to find native myth that expressed collective identity or the spirit or ghost of the people. It created a very disastrous and hairy Europe.
No, I guess that's what I was hoping to like kind of broaden this out into a little bit, is like, how do we do that in that way that doesn't do that? Like, how do you know, like, because you could say what you're talking about, like,
is the wrong place. I think
so, yeah. Like, it's like, because like the kind of without getting like, this is more philosophical, I totally get, but like the Heideggerian idea, like Martin Heidegger, the idea of, you know, being rooted in place, which in some ways echoes some of the things you're talking about, but had a very, very dark side to it too. We know I'm wondering how do we rescue that without being exclusive?
Heidegger's sense of person or Dyson is very powerful and very attractive and very alluring. What turns people off is their nervousness that he ended up being very dodgy on certain issues about Nazism. I don't know the details of it, but I know that's
he was a supporter. Yeah, he was a card-carrying member of the party.
But what I'm saying is that they're right to be wary, because in all those attempts in the 20th century to find, there was a movement which was kind of post-religious religion. And it was very much founded on myth and mythology and the fresh discovery of mythology as some sort of, mythology became authentic. And so people thought, well, let's find Finn McCool's mythology, and then that'll be us, the people, the Irish people, will be like that. In fact, you do find it a little bit in a soft way coming through Yeats and then into the kind of collective sense of being Irish in Ireland. And what's again wonderful now is that the Ireland that we now think about is one to do with multicultural people from everywhere who belong on this island because they're on this island. And they bring with them their own full identities, complete and full British, Unionist, Chinese, Asian, whatever you have in yourself. It's a sense of we can be Irish as an Irish Republic in a very healthy way. Here's the fundamental difference between those 20th century ideas. They were clinging to mythology, which sometimes actually establishes identity by differentiating yourself from others. So that if you were, for example, in Poland, at the time of that great sculptor, I forget his name now, but again, he was very dodgy in like, his mythic work seems like it's feeding people who want to belong to a sense of identity that keeps other people out, right?
It's exclusive, yeah, it's an exclusive sense of identity.
Yeah, and it came up everywhere in the 20th century as Nazism and fascism, and there's a little bit of it still going on in certain countries in Europe in relation to identity. And I think it shows that maybe mythology was not the way or the foundation to start some sort of new sense of, collective. I think that the key to it is relationship. Relationship, not myth. I couldn't care what your myth is. In fact, I'm not interested in myth. But I'm interested in loving you. When I sit down with somebody in a gala shop and they're a stranger, and I say, how are you doing? And they say, I'm not well. I had an interview with Beaumont this morning and I think I've cancer. I want to feel that I love that person or that they could love me because we're actually the same. And it doesn't matter if that person was born in the East End of China, in a city that I never could pronounce the name of. We are still human. So this sense of relationality, instead of myth, right, it means that the history of the world begins at zero every time you meet another person. The next person you meet in your life, that's the beginning of your life. That's how wonderful it is to meet another human being. Now, that dynamic is I suppose, what I've spent 20 years writing about, or illustrating stories from that dynamic. And I think that I feel deeply that the catastrophe that awaits us on the planet Earth can be averted fundamentally by discovering new models of relationship, not just with other humans, but with animals and with trees and with lakes and with mountains. You know, the kangaroo I read this morning in The Guardian, the kangaroos be talking to us all the time and I didn't know it, right? But I know that
they have a language that we can find a way to make intelligible.
Yeah, and the crows in the trees outside, I know that the crows that are in the trees outside this room have a language of grief. I know from reading all the science on it that when one of them dies, they grieve and they remember. And I know that, for example, when they meet a dangerous human, crows will pass on the information to other crows and signal, that guy down there, stay away from his house. So to begin to encounter those presences as real presences, that in that moment they are revealing to us the entire universe. The universe in its completion is one. And if I'm talking to my cat or if I'm talking to a crow, I'm talking to the universe. And that is what I'm saying is something that's possible to nurture in rural Ireland. You don't have to live in rural Ireland to get that. And the research and the future technologically will happen in cities and in universities. But in rural places in Europe, we can support rural life and community and nurture this sense of reverence. And that's a better way to keep faith alive, rather than the idea, which was 20th century, which said, well, that old mythology of Christianity was rubbish, but here's a new mythology. You know, believe in this mythology. The real liberation is to realize you don't need the mythology to actually believe. Belief in itself is just a kind of an open-hearted excitement about whoever is standing in front of you.
And do you think that's kind of what your journey on a personal level has been then? Is to move from like a big experience with organised religion into like kind of because what you're talking about, I think, is like kind of almost re-understanding the relations you have with the world around you. Do you know, it's like it's kind of reorientating yourself and going, okay.
Yeah, it's called wakening up, or it's called growing or maturing. There's different words for it. I didn't know when I started out in life that I would end up where I am. Everything is an accident, and everything in my life has been an accident. But when I look back, I see the pattern. And if people challenge me and say, what are your books about, or what is any of your writing about? I'd say it was about me when I started. I wrote plays that were really about me. They were about my loneliness within the church. They were because I was an ordained priest at the time. They were about my anxiety sexually when I was young and uneducated. They were about the usual things that novelists write about. And they were about the troubles in the north because I lived in Fermanagh during the troubles. But gradually I realised that there was a bigger job to be done, which was telling other people's stories. So I became, I suppose in the past 20 years, a chronicler, like a genuine journalist that was journaling or chronicling what was happening around me at the level of the heart. You know, so that you could walk into a shop and meet somebody for 2 minutes, and yet you could have an encounter with them that could change your life. And that people are doing that all the time. In fact, our whole sense of identity is made up of relationships. And I think gradually, without planning it, I realized that's what I had become. I was kind of bearing witness to my deepest sort of spiritual conviction that religion was not about institutions, and it definitely wasn't about mythology, but it was about you, the next person I meet. Michael,
what about those times when it's hard? you know, and I'd like to think there's definitely times where what you're talking about, I can really appreciate it, and I can think of those moments where, you know, it almost feels like the topmost, you know, kind of like when I'm feeling most in the world and I'm most able to connect with people. But there's days I find it hard to connect with people in that way, or there's days where I don't have as much energy. I don't, you know, like where life doesn't look quite as rosy. And is that, you know, like, is that, you know, it's what you're talking about. I like this idea of horizon values, you know, something that you're trying to aspire to, but you don't always meet. Truth is a horizon value. Like, there's this thing you can approximate towards it. And is that, like, I'm just wondering, like, you know, is there times in your life where that being in the world like that is difficult?
Well, I mean, I was always a melancholic person, even as a boy. And I always had a feeling that melancholy within me was a really good well for writing. So when I was a teenager in my 20s, I wrote poetry and then I wrote plays, and I felt that melancholy was my kind of fuel. But in 2011, I burned out from work, and I was doing one-man shows around the country, and I became exhausted. I developed colitis and a few other issues. I ended up in hospital for operations, and when I came out, I fell into depression. And for about 2 years, I really didn't come out of the room much. I stayed in the bed. I struggled to get out of bed. I went through really something that I didn't believe was so terrible. I would hear people talking about depression, but I really didn't know that it changed your life and it made you feel, I'm now in a different universe and I'm never going to get out of this universe. I'll never get back to the way I was. And it went on for about 2 years, and I struggled through it. I went to therapy, and that was hugely valuable. I shared my feelings with the people who loved me around me, and that was valuable. And the most valuable thing that they said to me at the time was, you will get out of it. Because I learned that when you're depressed, one of the delusions that comes upon you is the feeling that I'll never get out of this. It's a shocking feeling. But gradually I did come out of it, and gradually I began to integrate it into my whole personality as being melancholic. I mean, I found certain things in therapy that you'd say, yeah, that might have been causing it. And then I found that maybe there were physical things causing it. So how people fall into depression can be a result of medical, physical, social, psychological issues. But it's all the same once you're in that dark room. And I think that was the moment where I really began to energize myself in a new sense of faith. You know, I realized that if I had faith, I could still have fallen into depression, but it's very hard to get out of it if you've only negative voices in your head and you don't have some sort of inner heart joy that kind of not gives you an intellectual reason to get out, but gives you a feeling that it is okay to go out to other people and to talk to other people and to connect. And of course, that is really what heals you when you're depressed, other people.
And is that how you got out of that? You know, because 2 years is a long time. Like, is that like, what was the process like of coming out of that?
Well, it was gradual. I mean, it was from the lowest moment was the moment after my operation in Dublin, and I came home here to Leitrim. From that, it was probably a 2-year journey until I felt fairly normal again, you know. And the process was, I would say, therapy was as essential as going to any other. If I had a medical illness, I go to a medical doctor. And therapy, you know, therapy awakens in you issues to do with your childhood, issues to do with this, that, and the other. And that is a healing process. But what I'm saying to you is that I think that the biggest healing process for me was actually through what I'd call faith experience, of discovering that the way I am being, I don't feel it's just me. I don't feel that my deepest inner being is just an isolated part of the lonely, existential, empty Michael Harding that's wandering around confused. that in some sense there is the knowledge of knowledge. There is the corner of your mind that's aware of the rest of your mind. There's the bit of you that's watching all the negative thoughts and aware that they're negative thoughts. And gradually, by nurturing that part of the inner self or of consciousness, you're able to lessen the negative thoughts. You're able to nurture positive thoughts. And gradually, like the first crocus will no doubt appear in the end of January, but gradually the cycle turns, the wheel turns, and you find that joy has actually returned to your life. So that's how it happened for me.
And in some ways, is it that process, like of kind of, it's a slow process, but of like attending to your, like, not confusing your thoughts with who you are almost, like kind of trying to pull those things apart and be aware of that, like these things exist, these negative emotions exist, these negative feelings exist, but they don't have to be formative. You can actually create something else out of them.
Well, not only do they not have to be formative, but they don't have to be imprisoning. I think for me the key wasn't that I actually discovered what was wrong with me and sorted it. I discovered what was wrong with me and realized that's okay. That whatever imbalances there are in my personality by the damage of, psychological damage through childhood or growing up or whatever, actually just being aware of it is okay. That's what I think I found the healing process. That, I might have a complex about my father or my mother or whoever, but I realized, something, I probably will have it till I'm dead. Right? But it's okay. Because I'm not responsible. I am not this empty totality walking around with existential anxiety with a big hole in my psyche where God used to be. I'm not that. The hole is still there. The empty space is there. And it's like a presence within me on every breath. In every breath, there is a presence that's watching the breath. And once you fall back into that beautiful, it's like falling into the mother's arms. You're safe. It doesn't matter what happens. And even if you were watching this, I'd say to you, well, try it out. Supposing you tell yourself it doesn't matter what happens to you in the next 12 hours. A lot of people would immediately react negatively, and they'd say, it's all right for you sitting on your arse up in Leitrim. I have 3 children to rear. I have no money to get the dinner this evening. I have to worry. But that's exactly the problem. It's all this stuff that draws us into anxiety. And so again, it's very hard to find these, I'm saying that there's a space of refuge in rural areas for the world globally. But what I'm saying is that for every individual, there is a space of refuge. It's like a little woodland, and it's actually inside your heart. It's actually inside you. You can actually be in this woodland and feel that you are related to otherness of the cosmos around you, even if you're on a bus in a busy city.
And I guess that's exactly, it's trying, you kind of can start to see how if you change, I guess what's interesting about this too, I'll open up for questions in a second, is that like we've spoken about a lot, I think, about like intangible ideas, about kind of philosophical ideas, about religious ideas. We've also spoken about quite hard, mostly kind of like the economics of the world, and like Frederick Jameson calls late capitalism, this idea that you get to this point of capitalism where people you commodify yourself, and you become the product. We see that's Facebook, it's everything else. And, I'm really aware, say, younger people having to present images of themselves to the world on social media. I feel very lucky to have managed to avoid that when I was younger, and you get to an age I'm at where you can kind of use it rather than feeling it uses you. But at the same time, I think we're seeing a lot of people react to that and realizing that's an empty thing. That behind all of that production of a certain image of self, it makes it very hard for you, the human being, I think, to coexist, because the dissonance between those two things. And I think I hate that term, the snowflake generation, because I think actually what people are going through is actually really genuinely cognitively really hard, because you're having to put out a sense of self that doesn't match it doesn't match the absence that's behind it.
Yeah, I think that the younger generation are also very subversive about this. And I think
they're becoming increasingly so. That was actually the kind of point I was hoping you'd bring up. Yeah, I agree. They're rejecting it, I think, more and more.
Yeah, but they're not rejecting it by going away from it. In other words,
no.
The idea that you can sort of go away from the city and live a sort of a 19th century bohemian life, it's kind of not on for 6 billion people. We need the technology, we need everything to move us forward. But I'll give you 2 examples of subversion in culture. One, very simple. They gave washing machines one time. This is a test done by sociologists in Africa, and they gave washing machines to a village that they might have easier ways of washing the clothes, and this would help the women. And then they went back a year later and the women were still in the river washing the clothes. So where was the washing machines? And the men were using them to store beer. Right? That's completely subverting what the intention was. In a bad way. They were kind of, that was a proof of maintaining patriarchy in a small village. But I'll give you another one. I travelled Mongolia 2,500 miles with 9 lamas and monks and nuns. And they were all Tibetans or Mongolians except for me and a nurse. And 2,500 miles in the mountains was rough. And so we insisted on bringing 9 litres of water because we didn't want to be drinking from the streams and getting E. coli. And they didn't want to take the water, but eventually they agreed. And so they agreed to take the water, and then the following morning, after the first sleep and breakfast, tenting in tents out in the hills, the nurse came to me, she says, "Did you see the water?" I said, "No." So what happened? All the monks decided that they needed to wash their hair that morning. Just came on them all collectively as a big rash. They all needed to shampoo their heads, and they didn't have much hair. But it meant there was no water. They were telling us, "You'll do it our way," right? Now, they're subversions. And I think that Facebook and technology commodify us, and they're there to pump us into more capitalist dynamics. But what happens with the young generation is they begin to subvert it and reinvent it and say, well, we'll use it for our own purposes. And it was used in COVID for purposes that was never planned, to keep families together and close and to share celebrations and to keep communities close. Things that weren't originally part of the capitalist idea of people using Facebook. So I'm very positive about technology. And I'm also very positive, I think that young people do have a real instinct that there is a kind of a new consciousness just on the horizon, a sense that they're already beginning to create an entirely new concept of Western culture that rediscovers reverence for the cosmos, for the world we live in, and for the people who are around us, no matter what their mythology, ideology, or nation.
Michael, that feels like a very fitting moment to bring kind of my hogging the floor for quite a long time to an end. Thank you very much. I'm going to open it up to some questions there. I'm going to start with Jane, I think, has a question from the Irish Consul.
Thank you both very, very much. That's been a fascinating conversation ranging through so many areas. Michael, I'm really struck by the comments that you made about the connectivity with people. And you both started earlier on talking about how the technology has allowed us to connect in new ways. But I know your existence as a writer is quite solitary, but particularly with a new book out, you'd usually do a book tour and be in and out of studios. And with lockdown as well, that's reduced your interactions with people. And I certainly relate to the loss I've had in that regard, both professionally and personally. As the Consul General, I should be beyond the front door of the consulate, going around Scotland, engaging with the Irish community and meeting people all over Scotland. And I've really felt the loss of that. And I wonder how you feel, apart from the technology, we can hold on to that and maybe compensate it for it when our ability to meet in person is that bit more restricted.
I think it's very difficult. I do think it's very difficult, and there's things that happen. For example, this morning I was writing in the Irish Times about the Christmas lights, and there was a lot of people tweeting after reading the article that their experience was the same as mine. People have put up more LED garish lights around their houses and in their gardens than ever before, and I only kind of got seduced by this recently. I avoided it. I thought it was vulgar. But now I realise that having the whole garden glowing with Santas and reindeers and all that mad stuff it's like exactly what we used to do when we were children and put a candle in the window at night. It's a symbol. And I think that it's an example of how people are using symbols like that and rituals like that to get over the COVID and to bring people closer. There was a wonderful and great and powerful Irish sculptor died during the year, and I can't say her name now. It'll come to me. She's very, very well known. She was one of our great sculptors, lived in Ireland, but big connection with Italy. And she passed away. But her friends did the same thing. They had a Zoom because she was being, cremated, and the thing was in Italy. And so they had a ritual whereby everybody who knew her across the world, Ireland, everywhere, they lit a candle with a little image of her at the same moment, on the same night, at the same time. And that, we did it here in the garden, and it was so intimate. You felt that your little candle was flickering, and the candles in Italy and Dublin and Cork all were one single light. So it's amazing how people, number one, through symbols, have used technology to subvert it. I think another way, if I could commodify myself for a moment, to give you an example, because it really is an example for me. I normally did and do a tour of Ireland with my book. The whole tour was organised, the dates were fixed, and I would go around with my book. That happens every 2 years. Didn't happen this year. So instead, to make some connection, I asked somebody, what is this podcasting about? And they told me, and I said, fine, I'm into it. I can talk to my audience for 40 minutes. And so I started a podcast in April, which I thought would last for 2 months until Easter. And I still do it every weekend for about 40 minutes on Patreon.com. That's me commodifying thing. But I'm actually only saying it to answer your question genuinely. I'm able to talk to hundreds of people like I was talking one-to-one, like it was a phone call. And it has an intimacy that I've never experienced when I'm writing a book or when I'm writing in the Irish Times. It has allowed me to just share things at an amazing level of intimacy. So I didn't know that existed, but I needed to connect with my audience. And therefore, again, I used something in technology to do it. So I think people are finding ways through the COVID. Oh, I've lost you, have I?
I muted myself. I might just take one quick question before I go to you, Jane. I know you've got a little bit of housekeeping to end with. Just very quickly, we've got one question here from Bill Roger, who's asking, Michael, how do city dwellers, how does someone in a city make this kind of shift? He's calling Love the Trees, this kind of inspiring future. Is there a need for a systematic intervention? What do you call it? A transition program, the kind of phrase, for people who are in the city.
I don't know that. I'm not a politician. I can't say what schemes there should be to support rural Ireland or how people in cities should be facilitated and grant aided to extend themselves into rural places like Scotland or Ireland. I don't know. But I do know that it's not about us and them. In fact, it's about people in cities rediscovering being in the world in the city. And I think there's a fair amount of that in certain European countries. I used to go and still do a lot to Warsaw, and the sizes of their parks, Saski Park and other parks in Warsaw, are I used to love Warsaw like I'd love living at the ocean. And it was in a city of 1 million people. So there are ways that people in urban areas can experience the fact that we're all on the same planet. The planet is over 60% water. It's mostly ocean. It's mostly landscape. That's what it is. We're only a small little portion of it. And the more we realize that it's like a mother, that there's a love relationship goes two ways with that. So I think it's not a question of like, well, how we in the city can, he's talking about something about praising rural Ireland. I'm not really. I'm saying that rural Ireland exemplifies the tectonic shift in a philosophical disposition that is necessary if the whole green movement is to go forward with any success.
Thank you, Michael. And I think that'll bring the end to my section of this. So thank you very much for the conversation, and thanks for the Consul General for facilitating it.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. And thanks to everyone who's joined us today.